vCluster lets you create virtual Kubernetes clusters on your main cluster. So you have the host Kubernetes cluster on which you install some of the components, and then you create virtual clusters for maybe different teams, for multi-tenancy, for cost saving, whatever might be the reason. But there are scenarios where you would want to use custom resources that for the software that you have installed on the host cluster inside your vCluster. And for that, there is a concept of generic sync. So generic sync inside vCluster provides a way to define additional resources that should be synced in a generic and a declarative way in few lines of YAML. This is still an alpha feature and can only be created in the multi-namespace mode. So how this works is like there are a few examples. You can see Cert Manager, Dapper, Istio, Carpenter, Knative, Traffic, Tecton pipelines. And let's say if you go to Cert Manager, there is a config.yaml file in which you have experimental multi-namespace mode true. This is mandatory. And then you define the generic sync where you define the role, and in the role you have extra rules. This is where you keep like what is your API group and what is the resources and what are the verbs that you want on those particular resources, then cluster role wide, what were those, and then export these, issuer and certificate, and then import. So this will define the sync between the host cluster and the V cluster for the custom resources. In this particular video, we'll be creating a persistent volume and persistent volume claim. So for example, you have to deploy a stateful application or you just need to store some data, then you use persistent volume. And for that, you can have your own CSI driver. So let's see how this will work. So first we have a 2-node cluster, kubectl get pods, kubectl get nodes. So it's a 2-node cluster. kubectl get SC. So we have one storage class, but what we'll do is we will delete that. kubectl delete storage class this. So this particular environment is Killer Coda. You can try out the complete scenario or this particular example using Killer Coda or any Kubernetes cluster. The next thing that we are going to do is the Longhorn install. So if you don't know about Longhorn, so Longhorn is also a lightweight, reliable, and easy to use distributed block storage system for Kubernetes. It's free, open source, originally developed by Rancher Labs and now part of SUSE. So with Longhorn, you can do all of these things like, sync with S3, backup on S3, partitions, multi-write to the files. So all these things are possible with Longhorn. It's pretty fancy UI and all that stuff. So let's install that using kubectl. Let's do this. So Longhorn is getting installed. Now the next step we'll do is vCluster install. So we have to install vCluster as well. So let's install vCluster. So just a simple curl command and we'll be installing the 0.21 alpha release. So vCluster is now installed. Now we have Longhorn installed as well. So what we'll do is kubectl get CRDs. So we have a lot many CRDs. So we have the longhorn.io CRDs, custom resources, which are there. Now the next step that we can do is we can create a simple cluster. Right now we are creating a simple virtual cluster using vCluster without any configuration file provided. Like we have not given any config file for the generic sync. Now let's get the kubeconfig file for this particular virtual cluster, which is awesome demo. And it has given us the kubeconfig file. So let's copy this particular kubeconfig file. So vi a.a, just give anything. And export kubeconfig a kubectl get pods -a. So you can see we just have one pod, kubectl get CRD, and we do not have any CRD synced for this particular cluster. But what we can use is we can actually try and create a PVC. So let's try to create a PVC, vi pvc.yaml. And instead of this, let it use the default storage class. So kubectl apply -f pvc and kubectl get pvc. And we can see the PVC is bound. So even though you cannot create the custom resources, but the native Kubernetes resources are still fine, and it will be using the storage class from the Kubernetes cluster, which is default. So it is still able to use Longhorn, but it will not be able to create the custom resources which are there and sync back. So for that, what we'll try to do is, So we'll go to the host cluster, and I have prepared a gist. So experimental multi namespace node true. This is pretty generic. Here, the API groups is Longhorn v1, and I've given all the resources, volumes, engines, replicas, settings, nodes, and then custom resource definitions as the cluster role, and all these as the export. So now what we'll try to do is we'll try to create a cluster using this configuration file, config.yaml. And now we'll try to create a new virtual cluster using this configuration file. So vCluster create demo2-f config.yaml. And it is creating the demo2 vCluster. And the cluster is up and running. Now let's connect to the cluster. So vCluster connect demo2 and the namespace vCluster demo2. Here's the kubeconfig file. Let's use this. Vi b.yaml export kubeconfig b.yaml kubectl get pods -a. So we can see we are inside the vCluster. So the next step is kubectl get CRD. And this is where things get interesting, because now you have the custom resource definitions and the custom resources you will be able to create inside that particular vCluster. So that's how the generic sync kind of works. And we can actually do a kubectl apply of the PVC that was there. We should see the PVC and the PV getting attached and bound. So all those things are working perfectly fine. So that's pretty much it about vCluster generic sync. Let us know in the comment, what do you think about the vCluster generic sync? So vCluster generic sync capability lets you create the configuration file and able to sync the custom resources which are there on the host cluster, so that you are able to create those custom resources inside your virtual cluster as well. I showed you the example of Longhorn, which was not there in any of the examples which are there in the official repository, but you can try out anything from the official repository, and I have shown you how you can actually create your own config.yaml file as well. So I hope you like the video. If you like the video, then make sure to subscribe to this particular channel to get more information about vCluster and general Kubernetes concepts. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next one.